panel discussion. We are going to go ahead and get started and look very much forward to the conversation that we'll share, a conversation that is driven by a vision for the unity of the church and gratitude for remarkable opportunities to learn together across Christian traditions in the past generation. My name is John Witvliet, here from the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, and it's a great joy to be joined by Kimberly Belcher from the University of Notre Dame, from Dennis Tamburello from Siena College, my colleague Ronald Feenstra at Calvin Theological Seminary, and colleague Clair Mesick here from Calvin University. I'm very grateful for this panel. I'm particularly grateful as a graduate of both Calvin and the University of Notre Dame to be having a conversation like this. And I'm also very grateful for a recent experience of travel in Northern Ireland, where Protestant Catholic conversations were, of course, painfully absent and contributed to so much hardship, but where one of the things we learned about peace that emerged through the Good Friday Accords there 25 years ago was planted by conversations of friendship that emerged among Catholic and Protestant leaders. How important it is to have conversations face-to-face that promote mutual understanding and awareness, especially knowing that North American Christians live in neighborhoods and in extended families that span across so many traditions. So I'm delighted that we can have this conversation today. And I'd be grateful if we could begin with a word of prayer. Let us pray. Almighty and loving God, how grateful we are to be people that set our hope on Jesus Christ and aspire to live and embody the fruit of the Spirit, grateful for the way that your Spirit lavishes gifts on the church. And thank you for the amazing prayer, Jesus' prayer, that we would be one. We pray in some small way today that our conversation will break open new questions and new insights, new learning about ourselves and about those in Christian traditions that differ from us. Thank you so much for each of our panelists and the experiences that they've had in listening and learning and reflecting. May your Spirit be at work through all we do. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. I'd be grateful to begin with a very simple biographical question that simply invites our panelists to describe what they do and where they are and where they're located as we enter into the discussion, and then we'll hear from there a bit more about their participation in ecumenical dialogue and the difference it can make for ministry. And so we'll begin with that biographical question briefly and start with Kim.
I'm a professor at Notre Dame. I'm a Roman Catholic, and I teach both Ecumenism and Christian liturgy there.
Yeah, very good. Do you mind just saying a word about one of the books that you've written, just to have a little window into that work?
Sure. Yeah, my most recent book is Eucharist and Receptive Ecumenism, and it's on the way of seeing the Eucharist kind of beyond these historical divisions in Western theology. Very good.
Thank you so much. And Dennis, if you would.
Hello, I'm Dennis Tamburello. I'm a Franciscan friar who teaches at Siena College in Loudonville, New York, which is right outside of Albany. My specialty is Reformation studies, and particularly the theology of John Calvin. I'm really glad that I'm not the only Catholic here. This is nice. I'm usually a lone ranger sometimes, but I've done a lot of work on Calvin and also on mysticism. And out of my work on Calvin, I got invited to join the dialogue, which we'll talk about later. So thanks.
Yes, welcome. Good to have you here at Calvin with that background. It's wonderful.
Great to be back.
Yeah, thank you. And Ronald.
I'm Ronald Feenstra. I teach at Calvin Seminary. I teach systematic theology, and I've been involved in Catholic Reformed dialogue in various ways for about 25 years.
That's great.
I'm Clair Mesick. I am a professor here at Calvin University in the religion department. I teach on, I'm in biblical studies, so I write and teach on Paul and the Corinthian correspondence and so on.
Very good.
Oh, and I'm Protestant.
Yes.
Protestant.
So in this case, two folks associated with Reformed tradition, two with Catholic tradition. Our conversation may range and draw on other traditions as well, but particularly that dynamic that unfolds. And then I've asked each of our panelists to take us into their experience in formal ecumenical dialogue. And some of us in the room have significant exposure to that, but most of us, this will be an introduction to the kind of work that's done in a very formal and official way between and among Christian traditions. And I'm thrilled to be able to orient us to that work. Now, Clair, I'm wondering if I could ask you to start reflecting on your experience and some of the highlights of the experience, some of the methods that make that dialogue go well, and as well as being open to pitfalls that emerge in really good conversations across Christian traditions.
Sure. So I am part of the Reformed Roman Catholic dialogue. It has different sort of almost rounds focused on different topics, so like 4 years on one topic, 4 years on the next topic. So I have just been involved in the most recent one, which is on the topic of justice and justification. What does the work of Christ have to do with justice in the world? So it's a little less focused on worship practices than these folks have done. In terms of the highlights, I think the highlights are, oftentimes we kind of define the other based on difference. Like, when I was young, if someone was explaining how Catholicism was different, they would say, well, Catholics are the ones who do that's different, right? But in reality, when we actually sit down and talk, we find that we have mostly vast commonality. And sometimes the things that we think are differences, they're actually just definitions. So we have a very similar view of justification and sanctification, but we don't use the same terms at all. And so it's very satisfying to kind of start and think, what are you talking about? Like, how are you using that word? And then once you dig into it, you realize, actually, we really have mostly commonality here. The other highlight has been finding points that are points of difference, but that are that really draw out something new that maybe my tradition didn't focus on as much. So, for instance, for the topic of justice, we found that the Reformed tradition, especially the sort of Dutch Reformed tradition here, we take the idea of justice one step further through the idea of shalom, right? God's peace. And our Catholic colleagues would take it one step further with the idea of charity, like agape. And both of those are in the tradition, but we sort of focus on one or the other a little bit more. And so to kind of hear how their idea of charity sort of permeates everything that the Christian is supposed to do, and our idea of shalom is sort of this ideal to which we and God are working towards, that was really empowering. Can I talk about pitfalls? I think the pitfalls, the real pitfalls, are more on the human level, like that frustration or that feeling of being misunderstood. That can be, it's not so much, at least for the Protestant Catholic dialogue, it's not so much a pitfall of we can't find common ground. It's more, the slight frustrations with feeling like your tradition is not being represented as you would like it, or what have you. We have the one pitfall or one tension that we have struggled with occasionally actually isn't a Protestant Catholic. It's progressive traditional, because of course justice and justification. There are, most of the group we're passionate about both, but there are people who think we should really just be talking about justice, or we should really just be talking about the atoning work of Christ. And so I think that like a willingness to recognize that where the other person is coming from is valid and valuable, and a willingness to be open to what the other person's approach might take. that's, I think, the best way forward for that.
Very good. And if I may, Claire, could you just say about how many people are in the room when these
Oh,
happen?
yeah. It's about 16 maybe or so. And it's so for Catholic and Reformed, it's also interesting because, we have maybe 6 Catholics or so, but then 4 or 5 different Reformed denominations. And those are going to vary. We've got the CRC and the RCA, and we have a good amount of commonality. But then we have the UCC and the Peace USA. Is that it? That's it? Yes. Yeah. So sometimes the Reformed denominations disagree more than the Reformed and Catholic.
Thanks so much, yeah. Ronald.
Yeah, I got involved in Catholic Reformed dialogue about 25 years ago when the Christian Reformed Synod, I'm a member of the Christian Reformed Church, and Synod was asked the question about question and answer 80 of the Heidelberg Catechism, which asks, what's the difference between the Lord's Supper and the Catholic Mass? And it describes a couple of differences. And then it concludes by saying, thus the Mass is basically nothing but a denial of the one sacrifice and suffering of Jesus Christ and a condemnable idolatry. So pretty strong language. And the question is, are we right? So we said we need to go to engage in some dialogue with the Catholics. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops was very gracious in putting together a team to meet with our team from the Christian Reformed Church. And we said we need to understand what the Mass is. So one of the principles that I learned very early on is listening is really important, trying to make sure we understand what Catholics teach. And one of the things we learned pretty early on is, although the 2 points that the question and answer 80 highlights are sort of true, it's a distortion to take those 2 points out of the context of the rest of the teaching of the Mass, so that now it looks different than what it really looks in real life. So we tried to put together what we understood the Catholic teaching on the Mass to be, both on the basis of listening to people and reading a lot of documents. And we wrote it up, and then we sent it to the Catholic bishops, and we said, do we have your right? They sent it on to Rome. And the Office of Ecumenism, which was headed by Walter Kasper at the time, well-known Catholic theologian, read it, and they sent it on actually to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which was headed by Joseph Ratzinger at the time, who became Pope Benedict the 16th. They gave us a few corrections, which we happily made, and so we said, okay, now we think we understand what you teach. And now we realize that what question and answer 80 says is a distortion, and the conclusions are really not warranted, so we made a recommendation to our synod that we should no longer be committed to question and answer 80. And after some deliberation, our synod agreed with that. So for me, one of the things I learned in that is the importance of listening so that you can say what the other side believes, not on the basis of what you thought you knew, but on the basis of what they are saying. And you can say it in such a way that they agree. They say, yeah, you've got us right. And if both sides do that, it seems to me that it's possible to make real progress in dialogue. And I think the pitfalls that I've seen in the 25 years I've been involved are often exactly the opposite of that, where somebody comes in and based on their prior knowledge or some textbook they've read or something, they already know what the other side believes. And so they kind of say what they think it is, and it turns out to be somewhat true, but not really, and kind of distorted and not very happily accepted. So it seems to me that listening to the other side is really important. And one of the other lessons I learned through all of this is that it's often easy to distort an opponent's position, especially in the moment when everything is hot and arguments are deep. So in the 16th century, I think it was easy for us on the Reformed side to distort Catholic teaching. And I realized Catholic teaching and practice, I mean, one of the things we got into in our dialogue, and this is another pitfall actually, is we often like to compare our good theology with their bad practice. right? We all can find bad practice in our own tradition, and we wouldn't like it if somebody compared their good theology with the worst examples in our tradition of how somebody practices the Lord's Supper or baptism or anything else. But that's what we tend to do, and I think that's a little bit of what's going on in Q&A 80. And I think that goes on in the church a lot. I think it's probably going on in the church today, that we distort the opponent, we look at our good views, their bad practice, and we look better. Well, yeah, anybody would look better if you compare their good views with somebody else's bad practice. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm supposed to start by talking about my involvement with ecumenical relations. Well, I got interested in the Reformation through a seminar that I took when I was in the first phase of grad school, getting my MA. And I actually did a study of Thomas Aquinas and Martin Luther. When I went to graduate school, I intended to pursue the question of Luther, particularly Luther and mysticism and spirituality. But that was right around the time that Luther's birth was being celebrated. It was 1983 was right around the 500th anniversary of Luther's birth. So there was a truckload of books and articles written, and I couldn't find anything that hadn't been ransacked. So my dissertation advisor, Brian Gerrish, said, why don't you work on John Calvin? And John Calvin and spirituality. And I'm thinking, I didn't know that Calvin had this warm spot in his heart for some of what I would call mystical theology. I wouldn't call Calvin a mystic, but maybe some others would. But anyway, I came to believe he had a mystical strand in his thought. And I did my dissertation on a comparative study of Calvin and Bernard of Clairvaux on the notion of union with Christ. It was, as I started doing this work, it was one of my great dreams of being involved in some way in ecumenical dialogue. And so I had to change my tune on one thing. You know, as a young theologian, I used to say to people, I don't want to be on the bishop's radar, because when you're on the bishop's radar, that means you're probably in trouble, you're about to be denounced. Thank you, Cardinal Ratzinger, right? And then I ended up being invited by the USCCB to be on this dialogue back in around 2002, 2003. And so I went from not wanting to be on their radar to working for them. And so I felt very privileged to be a part of the last 3 dialogue sessions. 7 and 8 were on the sacraments of baptism and Eucharist or Lord's Supper. And then also on, it was 8 that was on ministry, right, and authority. And then now, as Claire mentioned, we're doing this dialogue on justice and justification. It's been, like one of the highlights for me has been that this sometimes academic discussion led us to form some deep personal friendships. And I think when you get to that point where the people that you're in dialogue with become your friends, it becomes easier to approach the difficult questions, because we know we love each other and we're not trying to trip each other up. We're not looking for what's at fault in the other tradition. We're looking for, maybe sometimes we're looking for what's at fault in our own tradition and what we can learn positively from the other. And so it's been a really wonderful experience. So that highlight, just to give you an example, one time we were having a discussion about something or other. I forget what the topic was. I think it had to do with the notion of sacramentality. And one of the Reformed, who was a very formidable voice, George Vandervelde, some of you may know him from Canada, I think. And I actually had the audacity to say at one point, George, I think you're misreading Calvin. I thought, did I say that? That's the kind of remark that would have brought people to blows back in the 16th century. But because we were so together with each other in terms of the respect and the love that we had for each other. It provoked a laugh rather than an outbreak of violence. And so we really have come to appreciate each other. As far as the pitfalls are concerned, I think for me as a Roman Catholic, the main pitfall is sometimes when we get together and we have these conversations, I think it's fair to say that the people that are involved in ecumenical dialogue are forward-looking people. I sometimes get frustrated with my own institution, the Roman Catholic Church, because there were times when we approved something, we all agreed on something, and then on an institutional level there was a blockade placed in front of that. In terms, we had this common declaration on the theology of baptism, for example, and some of the bishops held it up because they didn't like some of the language in it, language that we had spent months hammering out. We would sometimes talk for an hour about one word or one concept. And so that's been sometimes a little bit frustrating, and sometimes I'm embarrassed in front of my Reformed friends when the Catholic Church puts a roadblock up against some of our conclusions. But I still work for them, but I don't always agree with the way they respond to our work. I just think one of the things that you have to have through all this is a sense of humility and a sense of humor. And that's carried me a long way. But I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share with you. One thing, we'll talk, I think I've said enough for now. We'll save it for later. Thank you.
I've been on ecumenical dialogue since 2015, so less time than the rest of this team, but I'm also on 3 different ecumenical dialogues, so I'll talk about each of them. The first dialogue I was invited to join was the Methodist Catholic Dialogue, and it was because they were planning a document on the reception by people in the pews of all of the insights that had already been born out of that dialogue over the past number of years, and they wanted that reception to center on our common baptism. So that was a really interesting project where we were trying to think about how can we make the fruits of this dialogue, the doctrinal fruits, but also the relational fruits in this way that Dennis was talking about, accessible for people in our parishes and our schools, for the families that are, especially, we thought a lot about Methodist Catholic families, because there are a lot of Methodist Catholic families in the United States. I remember one of the priests on my side of the dialogue said he celebrates more Methodist Catholic marriages than Catholic marriages, so that was a little bit of an eye-opener for us. So that was really an interesting thing. And in terms of the relational piece that Dennis mentioned, one of the things that was really powerful about that dialogue was we were essentially watching the Methodist Communion go through a schism of the United Methodist Church over issues related to sexuality. And it was really very painful to watch that together, but it also was really powerful because it made us aware of the dimension of the dialogue that was a longing for the full flourishing of our ecumenical partner, which is, I think, that is, to me, like, that's the heart of ecumenism, is when I want for you to be the fullest Christian partner you can be, and not so much for you to co-sign on. And I think a lot of times we enter into these expecting that it's going to be a little bit more jockeying for position, and that really wasn't my experience of that dialogue at all. It was very much an act of, like, generous love for one another, and it was really powerful to be part of that. I also saw some of the pitfalls of our work, or potential pitfalls of our work on that dialogue. We had a lot of struggles around celebration of the Eucharist, and I think as a Catholic, this is probably the thing that's hit me the hardest. I agree with you also, like, being a Catholic ecumenist is like being a tiny tugboat trying to pull a freight ship that's also getting pulled in a whole bunch of other directions. at the same time, and yet it's good work, and I wouldn't give it up. But I think one of the things that was really hard on that dialogue is that everybody on that dialogue had a very deep Eucharistic spirituality, which obviously really helps if you're a Methodist in dialogue with Catholics, because you get it at a deep level, and that's something that's very important to us. But it also made the fact that we couldn't receive communion from one another's celebrations extremely painful. So early on in that dialogue, we had been celebrating the Eucharist when we were together and refraining from one another's communion, which is the rule for Catholics. That turned out to be really painful in ways that we really weren't even able to talk about as a dialogue. We just stopped. And we went back to just having morning and evening prayer, which is a little bit more common in my experience as a pattern. So that was one of the things that I think is, and I think that's a pitfall or a point of pain that extends out beyond the dialogues proper, but I think it's actually helpful if you're talking to people who are experiencing that point of pain to know that like that's an experience on our dialogues, like both Catholics and Methodists are brokenhearted about this. And I think being brokenhearted about this is the right, like that's honoring our division with the right sensation. Like, so in a sense, like it's right to be brokenhearted about the fact that we're still divided at the altar. And so that's been really a powerful experience. In the middle of, and now that dialogue, I'll say, has gone on to a second round where we're talking about baptism and immigration issues in the United States. And that's just getting off the ground, but we've done a lot of thinking about water and about migration in the scriptures and about how we think about our ethical commitments to other people as baptized Christians. So that's another, really exciting round that's going on right now. In the middle of the first round, I was also asked to step on to the Episcopal Catholic dialogue, which is the Anglican Roman Catholic. I can't remember. I think that's it. Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue of the United States. And that, because they were working on reconciliation, and reconciliation, not just like sacramental reconciliation. We actually didn't end up talking about that. I think they thought they were going to. But instead, we talked a lot about reconciliation around race in the United States, political reconciliation, ecological reconciliation, which I think is a dimension that is really not as often treated. So how do we think about reconciliation with creation? And that was a really interesting dialogue. One of the things that's really interesting about both of those dialogues from the perspective of like the Calvin Symposium is that they both came out with liturgical resources for celebrating together, whether on the Methodist Catholic dialogue, there are a lot of different prayer resources. And then also, like, how can Methodists and Catholics together pray for peace? How can we celebrate the liturgical year together? There was a lot of liturgical resources. And that's what I'm seeing at both the national level in the States and also the international level right now, is a lot of interest in how we can make liturgical resources which really make our ongoing reconciliation with one another real for people in the pews. Because I think, there are a lot of Catholics, let's say, who don't get super excited about justification, but who do get really interested, or at least are able to understand at a different level when we're able to pray with one another. For me, one of the real inspirations for this work was the Lutheran Catholic Lund liturgy in 2016 that was produced for the 500th commemoration of the Reformation, and then was released in a bunch of different versions in a bunch of different languages to allow local groups to make adaptations of that liturgy to celebrate that commemoration together. So that's been a real inspiration to me as I've been working on creating these liturgical resources. The Anglican Catholic document, which should be out in May, comes with a reconciliation liturgy that can be tailored to maybe situations after an experience of violence in our local communities, or maybe around local issues related to race or one of the other themes of our interreligious. So we have a section on interreligious dialogue between Christians and Jews, Muslims, and other religions, some stuff on indigenous relations. So these kinds of guides have been, I think, are really very helpful fruit that's coming out of the dialogues that are happening right now. And I'm seeing and hearing that in other of these dialogues as well. The Pentecostal Catholic dialogue actually just started in 2021, and we just finished our third year of what was called an exploratory dialogue, which was essentially to figure out if we had enough to talk about to do a real dialogue. And actually it was extremely fruitful, and it mostly focused on questions regarding ritual and liturgical worship. So that was actually, the Pentecostals came to the USCCB in 2020 and said, we'd like to have a dialogue on ritual and liturgy. And they were like, you what? So that was a big surprise for the USCCB. It's a really wonderful dialogue. Some of the things that have come up in there are really deep pastoral issues. Like we were talking about infant baptism, and then I mentioned sort of as an aside that a lot of Catholics use infant baptism as a way for us to think about the inclusion of people with profound intellectual disabilities. And that really then gave us a really different way of thinking about some of these differences. So Claire, I loved what you said about different emphases. And then we're also starting to be able to say, oh, maybe the Pentecostals don't want to do infant baptism, some of them do and some of them don't. But using our theological tradition of reflection on infant baptism and the church's tradition of practicing infant baptism for thinking about these pressing issues was really helpful for them.
I'm learning so much and grateful for the insight. For many years, I've had in my own library several of the statements that have emerged out of these dialogues. And I notice in my own library, they tend to be on one shelf, and books about worship tend to be on another. I notice in the Calvin library that resources from this work are in one area of the library, and materials related to worship are on another shelf. But picking up on these themes, it has occurred to me more and more over the last decade that worship is right at the center of the imagination in so many of these, and the fruit coming out of this work. And one of the dreams for a session like this is that in a conversation about worship, we should learn to view this kind of work as essential training for the kind of habits and virtues that we need, but also for specific insights that emerge from it. About 10 years ago at this worship symposium, we had a similar panel unpacking the fruit of the Reformed Pentecostal dialogue, I recall, and a wonderful conversation where it was the Pentecostal scholars that picked up on Benjamin Warfield's line that John Calvin was a theologian of the Holy Spirit, and reminded us about that aspect of Reformed theology that I think many needed to be reminded of. So many different ways that this connects with the work that we're doing here at this conference. So my next question to the panel is about worship in particular worship practice or fruit of the work that has come out. And Kim, I know if you've already begun to explore that, but I'll begin with you if there's any additional comments you want to make, and then we'll move through the panel in that way. So in a sense, we're also setting the agenda for future conversations and conferences like this, conferences and workshops and learning that people in this room host in different settings.
Yeah, I did save something for the second round. Yeah, I think the particular the set of practices that has really emerged for me as super meaningful from my experience on the dialogues is actually renewals of baptism, or the ways that we keep our baptismal faith living throughout the course of our year, throughout the life cycle. And what's been really interesting about talking with these different dialogues, so many of them have been focused on baptism in one way or another, is that we all have different practices that we use to continually deepen that baptismal commitment and expand that baptismal commitment into our different types of vocational works in the world. And if you're not on a dialogue where you're talking to other people, or if you're not actually talking to other Christians about what their practices mean to them, then you can miss some of those really important parallels. So like one of the things that was really interesting for me on the Methodist Catholic dialogue, they have a very important renewal of baptismal vows that they do on the 1st of January. I never would have thought of that. The 1st of January is a Marian feast for us. It doesn't it doesn't have a natural baptismal tie-in. We have a similar baptismal renewal, similar from my perspective, at the Easter Vigil, which they had, one of them knew about, but which they as a dialogue had not thought about. So these different ways that are, and I think if we think about the Reformation debates about baptism, which really treated baptism as a momentary thing, and where there's this huge question about when is it appropriate to do it, those questions become less important when we recognize in one another's churches the ways that baptism continues throughout the life to be a spring of our relationship with God and an ongoing grounding for our faith. So that's, I think, the best example for me.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how to answer this. I think for myself, we're making this connection between worship practices and the fruits of that. One of the things I learned along the way was the idea that Reformed Christians believe that there is a real encounter with the presence of the risen Lord in Holy Communion. Not that Christ descends into the elements. We know that that's not what the Reformed think, as if I understand them correctly. But one of the things that I've always been intrigued by is the notion that what's most important, sometimes we get sidetracked talking about the mode of presence and transubstantiation and things like that, rather than emphasizing the importance of not the transformation so much of the elements of bread and wine, but the transformation of ourselves as recipients of communion and participation in the Lord's Supper. And it just seems to me that there is this common ground that we share, that ultimately the Eucharist has to commit us to social justice and has to commit us to the commitment to save our world. It's funny that in the Franciscan tradition we have these three great priorities of peace, justice, and the integrity of creation. And I think that there's a lot of fertile ground for discussion there, even if we never resolve the mode of Christ issue, the transubstantiation issue. I don't know if there's ever going to be a change on that language from the Catholic side. But the whole idea that the Eucharist must bear fruit in our lives, when at the end of Mass now some of the dismissal prayers express that very nicely. So, for example, the celebrant or the presider may say, "Go in peace, glorifying the Lord by your life," or "Go and announce the gospel of the Lord." The idea that it doesn't just end when you walk out of the church building. It's actually the beginning of what are you going to do with this communion that you've received, and you have to become the body of Christ for one another and for the world. And I think that's a fruitful area of dialogue, where even in the midst of some disagreement over the mode of Christ's presence, we can agree on the idea that communion should transform us and make us better disciples. And I was saying to Ronald earlier, I was thinking, one of the things, when we got to the topic of relating things to discipleship, and relating worship, for example, to discipleship, that was an area where there was very little disagreement. In fact, there was no visible disagreement. When it came to the implications of the Lord's Supper for discipleship, we were right along right on the same page from start to finish. And so that's been something that's been very useful. And the only other thing I would say is, this kind of precedes the dialogue and has gone alongside with it, but the renewal of the Catholic Church with the Second Vatican Council and the fact that more emphasis is placed on Scripture. And I think on the other side, on the Reform side, I think there's been more, from what I understand, there's been a lot of discussion on the Reform side about the sacrament. So both sides have gained from the conversation with each other.
Like many Protestants, I grew up thinking of the Lord's Supper or Eucharist or Communion as a memorial service, right? I went to churches that had a table at the front that said, "This do in remembrance of me," and so it was a memorial service. And that, unfortunately, was kind of the end of it, as far as what I absorbed at least. And so it was through a dialogue that I began to see much more richness in the Lord's Supper, and the meaning of it, and what it's about. And the Catholic Catechism, Catholic theology, but other traditions as well, talk about how the meal is food for our spiritual journey. We are all engaged on a spiritual journey, and we each need the food that God provides for us. And God provides that food for us in this meal, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist. And we need that just to sustain us, to help us get through the tough times that we go through in our lives, and help us to do the sorts of things that Dennis was talking about as we go out from this meal. So it's like manna in the wilderness, something that God gives us. And of course, then the Catholics raise for us the good question, if this is such good spiritual food, why would you come to a worship service and decline to offer it? They offer it at every worship service, and Reformed churches tend not to, which was an uncomfortable question for us to hear and a good challenge for us to hear. Something else connected to the Lord's Supper is I began to take much more seriously through dialogue with the Catholics the call at the beginning of the meal, lift up your hearts. We lift them up to the Lord, the people respond. We lift up our hearts into the presence of the risen Lord. So Jesus Christ is present with us. And on the Reformed side, we didn't change our view. We don't think, as Dennis said, we don't think that the bread and the wine become the body and the blood of Christ, but we do think Christ is present. And one way that Christ is present is because we have lifted our hearts with the Lord. And so we are there in the presence of the ascended Lord, our Savior. And then we share a meal. And this is now a meal that gives us food for our spiritual journey. And this is a meal that anticipates the banquet of the Lamb when Christ returns and we are all called together. And so now here we are, the church at the corner of First and Main, or wherever your church is located, with the ascended Lord, and in my view, and especially through dialogue, with the hosts of Christians who have gone before us, who are there celebrating with us. We join with them and with our Lord in this meal. And to me, to envision this meal as something like that is much richer than just thinking of it as a memorial service. That's one thing I learned.
So, unlike these folks, I have not been in a dialogue that focused on worship practices. My dialogue just focuses on justice and justification, and that means that we have done, we've talked about baptism. We've touched very briefly on Eucharist and confession. But as I was thinking through this question of how does dialogue more generally shed light on kind of worship practices? I'm a biblical scholar, and so I thought the most of my, in some ways I did my PhD at Notre Dame, in some ways doing a PhD at a Catholic institution as a Protestant is just 6 years of dialogue, right? So I thought a lot about the ways that, for me, it's interpreting Scripture and teaching Scripture, but it also, I think, has an implication for preaching Scripture, right? I thought about all the ways in which, the Protestant traditions that I've grown up in and the Protestant traditions that form a lot of these commentaries are shaped originally by a polemic against Roman Catholic ideas. A lot of, when I was at Notre Dame, some of my Catholic professors would point out how interpretation of the Gospel of Matthew sometimes has a little bit of an edge against, pro-salvation by faith and against sort of a simplified version, their idea of salvation by works, right? There's an edge in some commentaries on Matthew. There's some of that in interpretation of Paul. And so one fruit that I've seen come out of talking with Catholic colleagues is to realize that sometimes there are other angles into text. There are other angles into preaching those texts, teaching those texts than I might have seen if I just looked at my own tradition and how they've interpreted that.
Thank you. And then the question about workplaces, soccer fields, neighborhoods, extended families, and how many of us are in regular conversation in those places across divides among Christian traditions. And so one of the questions would be, what resources from this kind of work could inform those kinds of encounters? I want to acknowledge this is a very big topic. I want to actually celebrate that Dennis and Ronald, for example, have been working on a resource they're eager to make available more widely coming out of their dialogue work so that it could benefit the pastoral ministry of the church. And I think, Kim, about your point about reception, so that part of the work is thinking, okay, how can the fruits of this come to bear in the lives of Christians on a daily basis? One of the things that I found myself thinking in this recent trip to Belfast is that it was important for a priest and a Protestant pastor to have a friendship that could give rise to new conversations, but how important it also was for people in their parishes and congregations to become aware of the friendship and get used to the idea, and even how getting used to the idea of that friendship was often very difficult, especially in that context. And so there's many ways that this reception conversation could go. I'm Clair, if I may, if we begin with you, we'll come back this way, and then we'll hear from our panelists, and then look forward to questions and other insights that you bring to the conversation too, about how we can pursue that good work together.
So in terms of what these dialogues can offer, or what insights I would want to draw out for like everyday conversations, this is very simple. Maybe it's okay if I start with a very simple thing, and these guys can go into more detail. But certainly the importance of both listening and speaking. So as these folks already described, of course you have to start by just listening to what we have all of our assumptions and kind of stereotypes about the other denomination, and starting by, I think you're the ones who do this, right? is not a good idea. We have to listen first and ask questions in here. But one thing that I have really taken away from the dialogue is also the importance of once you've listened, once you're sort of hearing and seeing what's going on, trying to put voice to the differences that you see. So a lot of times in our dialogue, the point at which we make the most progress is when one of us says, okay, what I hear you saying is that your tradition is similar in these ways and different in these ways, or this is the importance of confession, this is what happens in confession. And I think that in everyday circles, sometimes we're afraid to do that. right? We don't necessarily want to, we're afraid to encounter and wrestle with difference. And there can be a little bit of a you do your thing, I do my thing, but we're not going to really sort of put ourselves out there and say, this is the difference that I perceive, or this is the sort of this is what I understand your tradition to be doing. So I think that that being willing to sort of step out and say, can you explain sort of what's going on in this part of your tradition? Or I've always wrestled with, I don't understand the place of the saints, for instance. Or I think that can be having to step out and sort of make a guess and make a stab at sort of that difference can be a fruitful position or fruitful avenue for more understanding. You just have to be willing to be told that you didn't get it right? That you didn't quite understand it.
I think one of the ways that it would be very helpful to just engage in ground level conversations, let's say with a family member or a friend who's, and I'll assume if you're Reformed, and with a Catholic family member or friend, is just to talk a little bit, like in a non-defensive way, what attracts you to that church? How does it meet your spiritual needs? I think it'd be great to go together to a worship service, or to join each other in attending a worship service of your own, of the other side's tradition, and just observe. And then afterwards, again, non-defensively ask questions like, tell me what's going on here, and then ask, what is that? What in the worship service really nourishes you? Right? When I've gone to Catholic Mass, one of the things, and it's partly I think because I have often when I've gone, it's been in a downtown place that gathers people from all over, but it's often spiritually moving to me to watch people that look like they come from every end of the spectrum and every racial and ethnic background walk up and receive the Mass together. And it looks like the people of God. And it doesn't look like just one slice of humanity, but it looks like a big swath of humanity, and there's something powerful about that. So I think that one can learn a lot through that sort of dialogue. Actually, John mentioned it, but Dennis and I, who've been involved in this dialogue now for over 20 years together, and have become really good friends through that, are working on a book that we would like to encourage. When it's done, we would like to encourage a local Catholic parish and a Reformed or Presbyterian congregation who probably both have people who are married to Catholics or Catholic family members, or just anybody who's interested, to get a small group together with a few people from each side and just go through some of the same issues that we've gone through in our dialogue and use the resource to walk through those. Baptism and what's going on in baptism. How do you understand it? What do you mean by the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, and how does that nourish your faith? How do we think about the church and the way authority functions within the church? Those are the topics that were part of the rounds that Dennis and I are working on, and just learn from each other. What I have found is that I've learned more Reformed theology from Catholics, not because they're telling me, but because they ask me a question like, what do you think baptism really does? We think it justifies. What do you think it does? And I have to scratch my head and say, I don't know. We'll get back to you on that. And so I've learned a lot having to research my own tradition in order to give a decent response to my dialogue partner friends.
Yeah, on that note, sometimes we would, be engaged in some dialogue about a particular point, and we started out with the assumption that we thought we were on the same page. Like with regard to baptism, for example, we thought, well, this should be easy because we recognize one another's baptisms. And then the more we talked about it, the more we started asking the question, well, maybe we shouldn't recognize each other's baptisms. Maybe, I'm not suggesting that we go that way. Don't misunderstand me. But that, sometimes where we thought there was a lot more disagreement, we found out that there was, a higher level of agreement. And on the same page with regard, for example, to the Lord's Supper, and conversely, where we thought we had it all in the bag, that was all decided, we started second guessing ourselves. But I don't know, for me, one of the things we tried to do in this book, which we're calling Learning from One Another, is to take these conversations that sometimes can get, when you get a bunch of theologians and pastors in the room, things can get pretty heady sometimes. And so our desire was to take this and make it something more accessible to our congregations, and to give people a well-explained set of backgrounds so that they could have conversations with each other. I've been very fortunate because, I'm an ordained member of the Catholic Church, and people know that I often get drawn into conversations about different churches and the differences among various Christian denominations, not to mention the differences between Christianity and other religions. So I'm often in a situation where I have the opportunity to discuss things with people. And, a lot of the people I work with, it's like Siena College is a Catholic college, but sometimes you wouldn't know it when you looked at the attendance at Mass. There's a lot of kids who are kind of unchurched. And so, in some ways, they're not asking these questions because they're asking more fundamental questions about, why should I even be religious at all, let alone this or that version of it. But what I find when I open up my heart to these questions that people ask me, oftentimes it will lead me to invite them to a service. Why don't you come and observe a Eucharistic, a Lord's Supper service, and see where that takes you, see what kind of experience you have with that. I think the way the question unfolded when we were planning this, I think I might have misinterpreted the question. I was talking I thought in terms of the unchurched. But I think it is, I forget who it was, whether it was Kim or Clair, who brought up something about dealing with the unchurched and even the unchristian. I can't remember which of you had mentioned that in your remarks that we shared with each other ahead of time. But anyway, it's an opportunity, I think, in some ways, I think of what happened during the age of the so-called Enlightenment, where there was so much disillusionment with the disagreements among the churches and how much bloodshed and violence was unleashed during and after the Reformation period, that a lot of people, that was one of the things that made it easier for people to critique the Christian tradition at its root. And I think now we're at a slightly more open-minded age, I would like to think. But to bring up these questions in conversation, I think ultimately and hopefully will lead us to, invite people to worship with us, or to at least observe a worship service, and see how that jives with their own experience, if that makes any sense.
Thank you.
When I think about this question of kind of everyday ecumenism, there's these two little stories that I think of. One is I was at a bridal shower one time, and I was talking to somebody who does religious formation in a parish, and I suggested to her, that part of religious formation in a parish might be learning a little bit about other Christian denominations and what's meaningful and powerful for them. And she said to me, I couldn't do that. I mean, no one would do that. Really, like, these kids don't know anything about their own tradition already. And I think that's a lot of what we face when we're trying to think about the receiving of the gifts of one another's traditions, is this sense that that it's a distraction, that it's not worth it, this anxiety that learning about the other is a threat. to who I am and my own identity, or the passing on of the traditions that are meaningful and valuable to me. And then I think of, I told her this because I've been teaching now for almost 10 years a class for undergraduates who have never heard of, literally they've never heard of ecumenism. Most of them are Catholic. They have no idea that the Catholic Church has any interest in unity with Protestants, or that we don't deeply despise Protestants at the beginning of the semester. So it really starts from a zero. And I remember one of the students in my class that I will never forget, who on the first day of class, I have them go around and say name and all of that, and then why did you decide to take this course? Do you have any goals for this course? And one of the students said to me, my mom is Catholic and my dad is a Methodist, and I don't know what I am, and I guess that's why I'm here. And to me, that kind of the brokenness that we're passing on from these ongoing, the intergenerational harm that we have been doing to one another since the Reformation is the answer to why we should be doing this. And so when I have students in this class go and participate in a worship service of a tradition that's unfamiliar to them, and then write about it. And every time, every student says how terrifying it is. And how out of place they feel, and how they feel like they're going to be judged when they go into somebody else's worship service, and they feel like they're going to be, everybody's going to be watching them, and everybody's going to be, suspicious of why they're there. And every time their experience is of a deep, profound familiarity, a growing appreciation for their own tradition at the same time. So they get this sense of like, the world of Christianity is bigger. The love of Christ is bigger. And the grace that's offered by the Holy Spirit is bigger than my denomination alone. And I think that's what I'm looking for when I teach this class. But also I think what we should be looking for when we engage in conversation, ecumenical conversation with just, whether they're acquaintances or close colleagues or whatever, is that we want to learn how to see what God is doing in the world in a way that's larger than what my denomination alone can contain, because we know that the glory of God is bigger than any one of our denominations can really fully account for. So that it's that kind of seeking where I'm not like threatened by who you are. What I'm doing is I'm trying to find God, just like in my own tradition I'm trying to find God.
Very good. We'll have time now for a few questions, and there is a microphone here that we would welcome you to come to if at all possible. Also grateful for Diane Dycraft, who's assisting here in the session, and if you're unable to make it to the microphone, we can also bring it to you. But we look forward to your responses and to the continuing reflections that will emerge. And Nola, we'll begin with you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I am very encouraged by hearing this dialogue, and it's very close to my heart because I'm married to a Catholic and I'm ordained in the Christian Reformed Church. There's a lot I could say, but when my husband and I met, I had already been acquainted with the Catholic Church when I served for a year teaching at the Theological College of Northern Nigeria. There was a Catholic seminary very close, and I became close friends with them and was given permission, after dialoguing about what the Eucharist meant to me, I was given permission by the rector of the seminary to receive the Eucharist there. And back in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, I met other priests who gave me permission to receive the Eucharist. And my husband, when we were married, we went through the Catholic Information Center, and the priest who taught that class on, it was called Interfaith Marriage, basically told him, follow your conscience in terms of receiving communion at my church. And so we both went to each other's churches and both received at each other's churches. Now, however, we do not feel that the climate permits that as much as it did several decades ago. At least at his church, I can't do that now, and he does not feel comfortable either, not because my own church would frown on it, but because of if his church found out. So I'm just wondering, is that what you see too, especially in the Catholic Church? We have more conservative, I think all the churches have both conservatives and progressives, and we see things becoming more conservative on our side too. But I'm wondering, how do you see it in the Catholic Church, and how would you respond to that?
I'm going to take a stab at this here. I think most people who know me would see me as a little bit more progressive with regard to this question. I have actually never refused anybody communion. I figure if someone comes to communion inappropriately, it's not for me to worry about. I want to leave that in God's hands, But traditionally, the argument has been that if you receive the Eucharist in the Catholic Church, it means that you're in union with Rome. You have to be in union with everything that the Pope proclaims and teaches. And in other words, there has to be this kind of visible unity. But I look at it, I've always looked at it for a number of years as we can celebrate union or unity that exists. But the fact is, we don't even have perfect unity within the Catholic Church, let alone, outside of it. And I think that there are times when maybe we can't have a totally open Eucharistic sharing, but I think there are times when we should open it up, or in the case of individuals sometimes, to celebrate a unity that is in process. We're not there yet, but we're on the way, we're working on it. We're trying to be unified, we're trying to understand and accept each other, we're trying to, be the church that Jesus wants us to be. And what harm could it do to have at least occasional Eucharistic sharing? I'm in favor of that. I know that it was much more prominent, like you said, it was much more prominent some years ago, and then things kind of took a turn to the right, And now it's hard to open up that again. Even the thing now that we're going through with, whether or not we're going to allow divorced and remarried Catholics to receive communion. Again, my objection to that is it treats the Eucharist as a reward for good behavior rather than nourishment that we need on the way to the kingdom of God. So those are a couple of my remarks. I may burn in hell, but at least I'll be in good company.
This is a great question. I actually wrote about some of the constraints around intercommunion in the 2020 book that John encouraged me to talk about. So what I see is actually, yes, there's been a retrenchment. But it's not actually as much a retrenchment in fact as it is we just don't talk about it. Mm-hmm. So there's still lots of intercommunion going on, and you can. So like in the book, I examined the kind of furor about the Brother Roger of Taizé receiving communion at Pope John Paul II's funeral, which was a daily occurrence. But it got in the news at John Paul II's funeral. And so I think, and most Catholics weren't aware, especially more conservative Catholics weren't aware of any relaxation of the communion restrictions. And so one of the things that you see in Catholic circles is that when things like this hit the news, then you have bishops' offices responding, and the bishops' offices are talking to Catholics. They're not actually talking about Protestant intercommunion. They're talking about our own communion restrictions against receiving communion if you know you're in a state of grave sin. And so they're like afraid that if they acknowledge that there is this kind of this Eucharistic hospitality taking place for Protestants, that then Catholics who have been divorced and remarried or other people who are in serious sin are going to go and think that anything goes with regard to the Eucharist. And I don't know exactly what they're afraid of, to be honest with you. I don't understand it. So we do actually have a number of sites that are recognized centers of Eucharistic hospitality, and that's something that's not always understood. So I'm at Notre Dame. At Tantur in Jerusalem is a site of Eucharistic hospitality, even with Orthodox. So even Orthodox celebrations there offer communion to all the baptized. That's also true for Catholic celebrations there. And Catholics who are there are encouraged to receive communion for Protestant celebrations. So that's something that an agreement that was worked out among all the patriarchs of Jerusalem of these different churches. So it was a lot of work, and that kind of work doesn't always get noticed, and we also don't necessarily talk about it. I'm also an oblate of St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota, which is another site of Eucharistic hospitality. It's a Vatican-recognized ecumenical institute, and that's just like Tantur, and that's why. And then there are more well-known monasteries, ecumenical monasteries in Taizé, in Bozy, in Shevtonia, that also have different kinds of intercommunion. So I think one of the things we need to do is talk about those places and reflect on what that means for these doctrines. And I think it's not so much our doctrines about the Eucharist, but it's our understanding of the church and what does it mean to be one church together. For Catholics, it's not just like I as an individual can receive, but it is like a communal bonding. And that's something we've been working on in the dialogues for decades. But I think that's the level at which there's still some reflection to be done.
Just a brief window into our dialogue for just out of interest. So we discussed this at some length within the dialogue, and of course, because this is we're representing the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, they're reflecting the official position, and what we heard was that if you, as Dennis was saying, if you accept, apart from these cases that Kim is mentioning of exceptions, if you accept the Eucharist, then you're signing on to the whole enchilada. So we had a long discussion about what it means to accept the whole enchilada of the Catholic Church. And that went on for quite some time. And then those of us on the Reform side said, okay, so you're telling us that every time the Pope goes and has an open-air public Mass, everybody's getting checked out, that they're really good Catholics?
Yeah, if I can add one thing. One of the things that I talk about in the book is we do have a policy of being able to give viaticum, like communion for the dying, of anyone who has a faith in the Eucharist that asks for it. Yes. So, like, it obviously isn't the whole enchilada. Our practice contradicts that.
Yeah. We'll have time for one more question. Thank you so much.
Yes. Good morning, all. While listening to you, I've heard a lot of Methodists coming up. I'm of the Methodist Church, Nigeria, and I'm happy that there's this dialogue going on between Methodists and Catholic Church. We have observed that you have to be baptized, re-baptized in Catholic Church if you're married to a Catholic. And as far as I know, baptism, I think it should only be once. not twice. And in actual fact, baptism, salvation, you gain your salvation. It is your interrelationship with God to gain your salvation, not the sprinkling of the water. Agreed, is good because you are being initiated into the household of God. But in Catholic, it's not so. You have to be rebaptized. And then you have to answer an English name, which does not augur well with us, because we have our tribes and we have our tribal names. And it's sort of, you have to adopt another name instead of your tribal name. If you know Nigeria very well, we have a lot of tribes. And you are being identified by your name. Once somebody hears your name, will say whether you're from the south-south or from the southeast or from the northern part of Nigeria. But that is not so with Catholic Church. Your identity is completely gone because you adopt an English name and forgo your tribal destiny. So I don't know what you're going to do about that so that during the reform, all these things can be looked into.
Can I ask a question? So if you, I want to make sure I understand what you're telling me. So if you're a Methodist and you've been baptized and then you marry a Catholic,
yes,
you'll be rebaptized
yes,
with an English name.
Yes,
that shouldn't be happening.
Yes, yes,
so that's
yes,
which isn't a very satisfying answer. But yeah.
What I was going to say is that I don't know how things go in Nigeria, but one of the features of the dialogue that Dennis and I were involved in was precisely the question of mutual recognition of baptism. And do Reformed churches accept Catholic baptisms and Catholic churches accept Reformed baptisms? And although that had been done informally in this country, there was never an agreement about it. And so we came up with a mutual agreement, which we were told in the dialogue was the first one that they were aware of anywhere in any country. So there may be others yet now, since I'm not sure, but we came up with at least a formal agreement that we will accept one another's baptisms, but that's only between the Catholic and the Reformed in this country, and the Nigerian context would have to address that as well.
Please do. Please do.
Yeah, Ronald, I think it was Ronald earlier who brought up the question of it's hard when we compare our good theology to their bad practice, and I think this illustrates that, right? That sounds like one particular context where there are some practices that aren't aligning with sort of the good theology of the Catholic Church, but rather are kind of going in a different direction.
Yeah, the English name thing I'm aware of, there's no reason that should be happening, but it has been going on in Nigeria for a long time, and it's been really hard work. So that part, I am aware that that's still an issue. But rebaptizing people who have been baptized in the name of the Trinity is something that's actually like global prohibition in the Catholic Church. So that should not be happening. So yeah, and I didn't know it was happening. So I have 2 doctoral students that are priests from Nigeria, and I'm going to go back and ask some questions.
And I also want to say that it's a real privilege to be able to have this conversation and to say how different this conversation would be in different countries around the world and how important it is to acknowledge that. Not only in Belfast, where I recently was, but I could imagine this conversation in Italy, in Nigeria, in Mexico, in Manila, in Tokyo, in Buenos Aires, feeling quite different in terms of the tone, in terms of history, in terms of the nature of relationships, of institutional partnerships. And so for us all to just continue to name those and to learn about those differences and the opportunities and challenges that come from that is also an important part of this work. And I want to be able to record that too. Please join me in thanking each of our panelists for their insights today and their work. So much to benefit, so much to learn. Deeply grateful. and thank you all for
setting
coming.
this up for us. Thank you for
You're very
arranging
welcome.
it.
Yeah,
Really,
thank you.
and thanks for coming.